particularly nervous today, nor am I particularly wearing technology, but I'm wearing a baby. So I get winded when I talk every once in a while. So my apologies, I have to pause to take a breath now and then. All right, so my student colleague and I are going to be talking, what my lab focuses on is physiological measurement and what it has to say about emotion that can be seen and emotion that can't be seen. So our theses today, our bodies are instrumental in our generation and perception of emotion and cognitive experience. This is very similar to the Damasio work you mentioned. But we're not always aware of our emotions and our thoughts, and physiology can help highlight these processes. So my part of the talk today will focus primarily on some of the theory and possible understandings of these things, and Steve's part of the talk will focus on some of the implementation of this work, some of the pragmatic aspects. Okay, so first, some examples of what physiological research can tell us about emotional, cognitive, and social processes. One example from colleagues Emily Butler, James Gross, others, these are people who have documented that people who don't show their emotions have physiological stress responses. So this raises a really important and central question that is a sort of theme that we'll run through what I'll talk about today, which is that people may have a lot of reactions that they're not aware of and may not show them. So if we're talking about something, for example, like facial recognition software, paradoxically, the less someone shows with their face, the more may be going on internally. So what Butler and Gross have both shown is that if you intentionally reduce your facial affect, keep your face very still, your heart rate goes up very, very quickly, as does your sweat gland response. And this has some really fascinating and interesting consequences. You're more likely to forget what you've said in a conversation if you are suppressing your facial affect. People will rate that they don't like you, at least in this culture. People are rated as unlikable if they don't express facial emotion. And people report longer-term stress reactivity. It has a physical health impact to reduce your visible affect over time. Another study from our lab, this is particularly work from my grad students Tria Van Cleve and Ashley Dugas, focuses on the role of body awareness. So this is again sort of related to this issue that Damasio talked about, and we have some demos we can do later if you'd like to see them. This is a phenomenon called interoception or interoceptive awareness. And to think about this for a moment, one simple way to work with this is something called heartbeat detection. So without putting your hands anywhere where you might detect a pulse, if you can take just the next 10 seconds to see if you can find your heartbeat anywhere in your body, quietly, and maybe we'll get a show of hands. So folks who are good at doing this tend to be especially high in empathy, this is not diagnostic. Not all the hands in the room went up, though your grad students in the room may feel very high in anxiety right now. That's appropriate. People tend to be more prone to anxiety if they can't detect their heart rate, although this is a bit paradoxical. People are more likely to self-injure when they can't detect their own body signals. The theory there from Matt Nock is that this is how people find a way of feeling their body when they can't otherwise. People who can't feel their bodies also are more prone to eating disorders. I mentioned being more prone to anxiety and that's a bit paradoxical. So the way that that's paradoxical is that anxiety-prone people can feel their bodies incredibly well until you make them anxious, and then they can't feel them at all, which is a problem. If you're anxious, you need to have some monitoring of what's going on internally. And this also tends to be, I think related to some of what you mentioned, Miriam, related to the development of psychosis. People who don't know where their body begins and ends are more prone to losing touch with reality. So this is one thing that we measure in our lab. And you need physiology to know this because you have to actually know what someone's heart rate is and what's happening in their body to know whether they're accurate. And my personal favorite implementation of physiology, Adams et al. In 1996, in a fairly controversial study, showed that college men in a study with the largest penile responses, using some interesting wearable technology, were the most, in response to gay pornography, were the most homophobic men. So again, first, not something they could admit to, or were likely to admit to, or likely to acknowledge, not a physical response they were likely to acknowledge, but one that was definitely happening and also corresponded to an intense defensive response in response to the stimuli they were viewing. So people don't always necessarily want to acknowledge what is happening in their bodies, which has important implications for wearing technology. So what could all of this mean? First, are increasing our awareness of processes outside of our typical awareness. You can monitor your body if you're directed to. You might not be doing it all the time, but what might it do, either actively or passively? One is that it might teach greater emotional awareness. There are some great tools out there that are used particularly among people who are not necessarily very good at emotional awareness to begin with. As mentioned with the Damasio work, emotional awareness seems to be fairly central in understanding all sorts of things that are going on for ourselves. If you're not aware that you're stressed, you might get a migraine instead of knowing that you need to slow down. So that emotional awareness of your bodily state could be helpful. It may also reduce perpetual stress, not just an acute stress, but stress over the long term. And sort of coming from the lab of Roz Picard that you mentioned earlier, this has been used a lot for support for people with communication disorders like autism, where part of what happens in autism is that people's facial expressions don't match what the environment expects them to match. But their bodily responses are absolutely remarkable and very profound. So someone who has autism, for example, might show nothing on their face, but their body, their heart, is going at 120 or 140 beats per minute, which it shouldn't do if you're sitting quietly. And so all of a sudden, they might blow up or explode or have a tantrum. They can't communicate necessarily that something is making them stressed. But someone else, if they're wearing a device that shows that their heart rate is escalating, somebody else might be able to say, oh, maybe I'm going to take a step back from you. It looks like my standing so close to you is stressing you. On the flip side, an increased sense of surveillance. We were chatting a bit earlier about people who take pictures of everything they eat. People might also have sort of hyper-surveillance of their bodily states and their emotional states in a paradoxical way that takes you out of living in the present moment. You can maybe ask Steve about this after. Being a good physiologist, he bought a heart rate watch, and I remember him coming in and saying, it says I'm stressed, but I'm not stressed. Or it says I'm not stressed, but I know I am. And so that sort of mismatch between your environment and your internal experience and what the device says you're experiencing could be a bit problematic for some individuals. And similarly to the penile-tumescent study, people might have defensive reactions to being told that they feel something that they don't know that they're feeling. This raises an interesting question that Steve will elaborate on of what exactly is an emotion. Is an emotion something you know you're feeling? Is it something that happens in your body? Is it emotion, if it happens in your body, has consequences on your behavior, but you don't know that it happened? So that's an incredibly important question that this wearable technology can help us to address. To talk very briefly about a dimensional model of emotion, this is going to help us in service of what we can and cannot say using wearable technology on the emotional front. There are lots of things that physiologists disagree about. We argue about absolutely everything that nobody in the world would care about. But there are two things that we do agree about, and that's that emotion exists on at least two dimensions, if it exists at all. And one is valence, and the other is arousal. Valence is how positive and negative it is. Arousal is how intense it is. Arousal isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's also not arousal in the sense of sexual arousal. It's just how active is your body. So to map this emotional space, there can be high arousal states that are positive and negative. So a high arousal positive might be excited, whereas high arousal negative might be afraid. On the flip side, there can be things that are low arousal, but are both positive and negative, so tired versus calm. And then things can also differ on the positive and negative dimension. The point of giving you this caveat is to say that you can't, many of our devices give you information about arousal states, which doesn't necessarily give you information about valence states. And Steve will talk a bit about how to do some of that work. So a bit of a caveat before I hand it over to him. If you want to be a physiologist, do's and don'ts. If you want to be doing some of this work, consult with someone who is an expert in physiological research. before designing your study and before spending a lot of money on equipment. Be clear about what your research question is. Be clear about what these data can tell you and can't tell you. They can't always tell you if someone's happy or sad. They can tell you more complicated things with that. And if you're going to practice this physiological work, get comfortable with simple devices first. Things like the polar watch is a very simple and straightforward device to measure, to use. So in line with that, don't start out by spending thousands of dollars on equipment. Equipment can get incredibly expensive. And a sort of note of caution, don't overinterpret your data. Again, don't sort of be careful about saying something like, well, the person's heart rate went up, so that means they were stressed. Don't know. It means their heart rate went up. It might mean that they were excited. It might mean that they were scared. It might mean that they were stressed. So these are sort of some examples of where to sort of draw the line and be cautious about your interpretations. Okay, and passing over to Steve.
So I'm going to look into some of the questions that Wendy just raised, particularly about sort of the status of decoding emotions based on some of these measures or some of these physiological measures that we talked about. And so I just sort of did a Google search and found the most convenient sort of first page results. So I'm really not trying to pick on anyone or any one device. I think that this really can be said for most devices that make claims about decoding emotions. The main sort of types of devices I want to talk about mostly measure heart rate or skin conductance, and I'll go into what those are. So heart rate is just basically the electrical activity in our chest, our heart pumping blood through our body. It's the largest physiological signal, so it's really the easiest to capture, but we measure it in two different ways. One is sensors placed on the chest, and I think that this is actually, they don't need to be that spread out, so I think that this is the way that the Polar device works. Measuring the electrical signals. But then also one that we actually use in our lab is a little thing, maybe if you've ever been to the hospital, they've clipped it on your finger to measure your blood oxygen levels and your heart rate. So all it does is when your heart beats, the blood pumps through your body and how much light is reflected onto this little device. The next is skin conductance. And so we all have many sweat glands all over our bodies, but we have most of our sweat glands, or the highest density, in our fingers and on our toes. And people think it's so that we can grip things or, I don't know, manipulate things when we need to. And really, all the time that we're having an emotional response or a strong emotional response, or maybe we're orienting to something, or there are a lot of other things, our hands and feet are sort of sweating in this very minute amount that we can't detect, but that we can detect with these devices. And so this isn't necessarily about exercise, although you will sweat from these places during exercise. This is really when people are sitting, resting, and there's an emotional response. We'll pick this up. And the way that it works is you just pass a very small signal through their hand, and the more that you're sweating, the more sort of conduction there is. So, because our sweat is conductive. So you can see, and on the bottom you see sort of what a nice skin conductance response looks like. And we do it on the hand just because that's where they are. We do it on the non-dominant hand so that there are not a lot of calluses, and people tend to not use those fingers very much. So are these two measures, skin conductance and heart rate, adequate tools to measure an emotional response? And this really goes to what Wendy was saying. It really depends on what you mean by an emotional response. We cannot really get it together as researchers in affective science to say what an emotion is. But if it is this, right, where we have these two axes, valence and arousal, can it tell us anything about valence and arousal? So I'm just going to look at some data. This is skin conductance and heart rate on the valence dimension. So people were shown pictures of different valences and then neutral pictures. So positive valence, negative valence, and then neutral pictures. And you can see on the skin conductance, so it got like a little bit grainy, but you can see the dotted line is neutral, whereas the other lines are either positive or negative valence. So we see that positive and negative are the same in skin conductance, and they're the same in heart rate, although they are significantly different than neutral, which is good. We can tell if people aren't feeling anything or they're not having any response. So what you would see on this graph is a nice scatter plot, a nice correlation, where the higher the arousal, the reported arousal of the pictures, the higher the skin conductance response. So actually, skin conductance does give us very reliable information about the arousal dimension, but heart rate really doesn't. And there are some sort of technical reasons for that we can get into. There are other sort of measures of heart rate that we can derive from heart rate that might be more interesting, but heart rate in itself doesn't give us either dimension. And so this is what we can tell from skin conductance, and people have sort of alluded to it earlier, that excited and afraid look exactly the same to us. And there's really not much we can do with just skin conductance and heart rate to differentiate those two emotions. So if we go back to sort of this chart where what we could tell from one of these devices was that you were tranquil, calm, ruffled, nervous, or nirvana, really it's tranquil or depressed, calm or sad, ruffled, excited, or happy, nervous, in love, or angry, or nirvana, or terrified, right? So what can we do to add something to the valence dimension? What physiological signal will give us that information? And there are a couple that we use in our lab. They're all a little bit more invasive in a way. If we try to sort of remap what an emotion might be, and this is actually from Antonio Damasio's latest book, they're built on basic sort of metabolic processes, basic reflexes, and immune responses, and that's really what we're tapping into when we tap into the arousal dimension. We're looking at sort of regulatory fight or flight, rest or digest type responses. When we look at the valence dimension, there are two valences and the tree sort of splits. It's pain or pleasure. And we get something more when we look, there are more sorts of drives and motives, and EEG can help us sort that out. But when you really want to know what the emotion proper is, the sort of industry standard in science is still to ask. And actually there are recommendations in sort of all of the papers about this, that when you want to, we still have to ask people what they're feeling. And then maybe we can say, oh, they weren't really feeling that, but we still have to ask.